Okay, so today's learning lab is fear of flying. So we'll just jump right in. So flying phobias are actually pretty common. An estimated 13% of the population has a fear of flying, which is different than a phobia. So that's just the normal anxiety, maybe scared to fly, but can still get on a plane if you need to. And then about 3.5% of people have a flying phobia. And so a phobia, the difference there is an unrealistic fear. A lot of times it leads to avoiding a flight, even if you need to be on one, things like that. So having that more exaggerated fear when it comes to flying. So it's pretty uncommon to die in a plane crash. There's a 1 in 13.7 million chance. So why is it so common that we have this phobia when the likelihood of being in a plane crash is pretty low? So I have kind of a simplified version right here of this risk assessment. So if the likelihood and the risk is low, pretty uncommon to develop a phobia. Of course, if the likelihood and the risk is high, makes sense to have a phobia, right? Something like a plane crash would kind of be in this upper quadrant. So the likelihood is pretty low, but if you were in a plane crash, the risk of that is pretty high, right? So it makes sense why people still are developing this phobia. Even though the likelihood is low, the risk is pretty high. And so sometimes that can increase that fear. And down here, still likely, but a little less likely. So the likelihood of something happening, but the risk is pretty small. So something like tripping while walking. Pretty common to happen, but you're not likely to get super hurt from that. And so less likely to develop a phobia of tripping. Well, it might be embarrassing or something like that. And so that's why we see more phobias with flying, even though they're super uncommon. So how do phobias actually develop? Different factors go into phobia development. So of course, a traumatic experience, like if you were to survive a plane crash, makes sense to have a fear of flying after that, right? We can also have observational learning. So not necessarily being in a crash yourself, but seeing one or hearing about it on the news. I feel like that's happening a lot more lately where people are hearing about these plane crashes, they're in the media, they're in the news. And so that fear is increasing for a lot of people. And then we also have information transmission. So this could just be somebody telling you flying is dangerous. You shouldn't go on that flight. Maybe you want to drive instead. So having those messages given, even if you're not seeing it, you're not experiencing it, but you're hearing that it's dangerous, that can also develop into a phobia. There are other factors that can kind of exacerbate those things and make it more likely for a phobia to develop. So having somebody tell you that a plane is dangerous might not develop into a phobia, but if you also have maybe limited experience with flying, you've never been on a plane before, you're already feeling stressed, maybe there are biological factors, so you're more likely to get lightheaded, or I've met with some people who have to go to the bathroom often, and so their fear of flying is more so feeling stuck and not being able to get to the bathroom in time. Maybe there's a line, turbulence, things like that. And so all of these kind of ancillary factors can make it more likely for a phobia to develop or make that phobia feel stronger. As with most anxiety things we know, we don't always know why they develop. We don't always have that why. We don't always have a reason. And sometimes it's more important to see what is maintaining that phobia. So on the side here, we have avoidance and approaching only with safety. So these are the things that keep the phobia alive. So if we have a fear of flying and we just never get on a plane, that's just reinforcing the fear. So that's keeping the phobia there. If we decide to approach only with our safety tools, so I'll fly, but only if I have a Xanax or a sleeping aid or something like that, where you're not really facing that fear, you're covering it up. So things like that can also keep that phobia in existence because You're just having something to help you through it, and you're telling yourself that you can't do it on your own. So those keep the phobia alive, and that's kind of where we work on the treatment part of things. So diagnosing a phobia of flying, pretty similar to any other specific phobia. So you can look at the DSM, see if somebody meets the criteria for a specific phobia, and in this case, it would be situational. So the flying would be that situation. There are a few measures out there that can help with this. I don't know if they're absolutely necessary, but they could be helpful if maybe you're not sure, or even to get a better idea of the severity of the phobia. I feel like a lot of these measures are used more in research, but they can also be helpful in diagnosing too. So those are some options there. And then for treatment. So treatment of flying phobia, CBT is often used. And the different elements to that I have listed here. So the first step, identifying those fearful beliefs. So what are the core fears, the core beliefs when it comes to flying? What are those thoughts that come up? And just recognizing what those messages are that you have. The second part is learning accurate information. So in this case, learning about flying is actually really helpful. Learning about how planes actually fly and the mechanics of that, the training that pilots go through, the safety measures that every flight goes through, walking through what a plane ride is like. And not just that, but getting to the airport, getting through check-in, and just learning about all of those steps involved can actually be helpful in this case. And so having that accurate information, as well as like the statistics. So kind of what we already talked about of it's pretty unlikely that a crash will happen, and being able to talk about those things. And then using that accurate information to determine whether these initial beliefs are accurate perceptions of reality or if maybe they're a little distorted. So then kind of examining those beliefs and trying to get a better, more accurate perception of what's going on. Then we can learn and practice relaxation strategies. So things like deep breathing, grounding, body scans, progressive muscle relaxation, things like that to help get through that anxiety when you are put in a situation that brings up that fear. And then, of course, you have exposures. And the most important part of this is to do the exposures without those safety signals. So again, ultimately trying to get on the plane without the Xanax, without the sleeping aid, whatever that safety signal is for you. So even in those exposures working up, we want to make sure that we don't have those safety signals or develop a new one that then the person needs to get on the flight. The shared drive has a really good resource for fear of flying. There's a PDF that has all of these modules and exercises and things, so you can use that directly with a client who has a fear of flying. But you can also use it for just information for you too on how you maybe want to conduct those sessions. Because flying is not a super accessible thing to just hop on a plane and have an exposure, we have virtual reality, which is a good option if you have access to it. And then, of course, there are exposure videos. So I have a quick one that we can watch. Switch my screen. Okay. Okay. So I hope you all could hear the sound on that one. The purpose of that exposure video was to show realistically what it's like in the cabin of a plane, what it sounds like when it's taking off. You can notice that it's louder at first and then it kind of evens out and is a little quieter. Of course, my laptop kicked on and made the airplane noise once it got quieter. So depending on what you're listening to it. So yeah, those can be some options for exposure videos, again, just to walk through those processes that happen when you're in a plane. There are other videos that show looking out the window. There are walkthroughs of an airport and things like that. So of course you would want to work up to whatever feels good for your client. For our activity, instead of doing like a traditional case study, I thought it would be helpful for us to practice some of these skills and go through one of the activities that you could use in session. So using the manual on the shared drive, I have a link, I'll put it in the chat, but it might also be a good opportunity to practice going into the drive if you haven't had an opportunity to do that and search. But here's the link for everybody. Hopefully that works. And so the first part of that, on page 27, there's a worksheet and it is about beliefs, common beliefs about flying, and then you rate the distress. And so I want everybody to kind of fill that out, how you actually feel, and then we can compare, discuss how that felt. And then one person to volunteer. So Lisa, will we go into breakout rooms? So we'll do that. And then if I can have one volunteer from each room to lead the diaphragm breathing. So to kind of go through that really quickly. So we have a refresh. The first step is to just take those deep breaths. So one hand on the chest, one on the belly, breathing into the belly, not the chest. So trying to move that lower hand and not the one on your chest, and just taking those deep breaths. The second part, just breathing normal amounts of air. So continuing with that deep breathing, not changing it, just breathing how you normally would. The second or the third part is counting each set of breaths. So not the duration of the breath, but the breath itself. So in one, in two, out two. And then the fourth part is to then start slowing that breathing down. So then you're counting naturally how many seconds is an inhale, how many seconds is an exhale, and then starting to increase that number a little bit. So if naturally my inhale is 3 seconds long, the next round of breaths, I want to maybe try for 4 seconds. With this, it's important to remember that sometimes adding counting to breathing can increase anxiety. I have asthma, and so sometimes it is frustrating if I can't slow down the breath to the number that I'm wanting. So you can play around with this exercise to whatever, of course, feels safe and comfortable for you and your client. But I think it would be fun for us to practice this together. Yeah, this is an activity, of course, you can do on your own, but if you wanted to do it in session, you would read it out. So, we'll go through some of these common beliefs, and a lot of people have these thoughts when it comes to flying. So I'm going to read off a thought, and then I want you to rate between 0 to 10 on how much you believe that thought. And so 0 would be not at all, 10 would be very much, like you really believe that, and 5 would be more in that neutral range. So the first thought, my airplane will crash. How much do you believe that?
Maybe like 6.
6. Okay. I will be injured.
6.
Okay. The pilot is not competent.
2.
The plane will have mechanical problems.
9.
The pilot's been drinking.
2.
I'll be unable to breathe.
9.
My fear will be overwhelming.
10.
I will faint.
8.
My physical sensations will be overwhelming.
Yeah, maybe a 9.
Okay. I will do something embarrassing.
Maybe like a 6.
I'll lose control.
8.
I will die.
4.
My flight will be delayed.
10.
My luggage will get lost.
3.
The pilot will not be able to maneuver the plane in bad weather.
5.
I'll have a heart attack or stroke.
2.
The noises I hear indicate a problem.
9.
My plane will be hijacked.
0.
Okay. And are there any other thoughts that come up for you when you think about flying?
Like there's nothing I can do about
Okay.
this.
Yeah. Yeah. So feeling kind of out of control in the situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it seemed like the ones that you rated highest was the mechanical problem, so something being wrong with the plane. And then the rest of them seemed like it was more about like how you're feeling in the moment. So feeling overwhelmed, feeling like you won't be able to breathe, and those kinds of things. Does that feel pretty accurate to you?
Yeah, it was interesting to hear the ones about the pilot. Like I didn't really have any concerns there. It was definitely more about how I would feel or things being out of my control.
Yeah, yeah. Which makes sense with like the mechanical problems. It's probably things that you're not really familiar with the mechanics of a plane, and so that would feel really out of control. And that's why learning about those things can sometimes be helpful because actually knowing how the plane is operating can make it feel less out of control.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's interesting for
Okay.
the one that you also not to number 16, I will have a heart attack or stroke. I do know we have clients also that I will have a panic attack. So that's a big one that I feel like I've heard and seen. So still that same idea of control, but maybe not so
Mhm.
much the heart attack, but very much the panic attack.
Yeah, yeah. And that kind of plays into what we talked about before with those biological factors. So if you do have a heart problem or you have had a stroke before, that fear would be pretty high, and being in a plane would be a really scary place for something like that to happen. So I could see how those would definitely be a little bit higher for people who already have those factors in play. Okay.
And then do we want to practice then some of the,
Yes.
thank you, Dr.
The
King.
breathing. And don't do it like SpongeBob. That is not the correct form. Do those steps again, but we'll actually take time and everybody participate as you feel comfortable. If you want to close your eyes, you can. Definitely not a requirement, but of course have a comfortable seat. And so we'll start again, one hand on your chest, one on your belly. And just kind of breathe normal, but really try to focus on that deep breath. So stomach rising on the inhale, and then in towards your spine on the exhale. And just take a few breaths. Again, we're not changing anything, just breathing normal, trying to focus on that diaphragm. Okay. And once that feels comfortable, you can leave your hands where they are if you want. If you want to take them down, that's okay. Good point. You can breathe out of your mouth or your nose. Either one is fine. So we're not trying to change too much about how we're breathing. And again, if it feels uncomfortable, if you can't get that deep breath for whatever reason, don't force it. Just breathe how you can. Okay. And the next step will be that counting. So everybody's going to breathe at a different pace. I'll do a couple rounds of counts for myself, but I want you to be kind of counting in your head because your pace is going to be different than everybody else. In 1, out 1, in 2, out 2, in 3, out 3, and then just keep going at your own pace. Again, we're not changing anything. Just breathe how you naturally would. Okay. Now start counting the seconds for each inhale and exhale. Again, don't change anything. Just take note of how long it takes for a typical inhale and exhale, and just do a couple of rounds like that. And if you can, try to add a second onto an inhale or an exhale. You can do both or just one. If it feels difficult to get more air or let it out, try to slow that process down. If you can even add another second on, you can try that. But if it feels like you've reached your limit, that's okay too. Just stick with whatever feels good. Okay. Whenever you're ready, we can come back. So, of course, in session, you can take that activity even slower. So, like one session, you can just focus on the deep breathing without doing anything else and take each step, each session. So, it doesn't have to be as fast as we just did it. It can be a work in progress because it really does take a while to get used to that type of breathing if you're not used to doing it. And the idea is to get to a point where you can tap into that breathing whenever you need it and use it as a coping skill. So practice is definitely important. I would encourage your clients to practice in between session, of course, and use it in a lot of different situations. So a lot of these skills we're wanting to do in different situations, different places, around different people so that it's easier in the moment. Because if you're only practicing at home when you get on a plane, totally different, right?
Yeah, I have a client with emetophobia, and
Mm.
so a lot of people get sick on airplanes. I mean, she doesn't fly. She's 9. She's never flown. There's no plans to fly, but she still has this like phobia of flying because she's like, "Oh my gosh, people are going to be throwing up around me and I'm going to be trapped in this place with a bunch of people around me throwing up."
Yeah. In that case, I mean, definitely working with the emetophobia in general is important, but I think you can do the work in tandem. So yeah, I think a lot of times those are tied together. And the bathroom issue too, I think just being stuck in a seat and not being able to get away if somebody else is puking or if I have to puke. Definitely not a fun situation. And so working on both of those things, I think, can be helpful. And of course, those coping skills are helpful for emetophobia too. So being able to breathe through that feeling of nausea or whatever's coming up. But yeah, if you know that there's an underlying cause to the fear of flying, I would say definitely try and work through that first if you have to separate them.
Thinking about how my client who has a fear of flying is 7. So we were just talking about, I guess my question was like regarding, is the rating scale, is there like a child version, or do you think it would be as effective with like younger kids, or like how do you usually approach the topic of like what their fear is regarding flying?
Yeah, I think you can definitely adapt these things for younger clients. So maybe just getting an idea, having them write down their fears, and then like how big is that fear? And so you can do that in like colors or monsters, or if you know they're old enough to do the rating, that they can do that too. So I think you can kind of play around with it and just get a sense of how big is this fear for you, and then can we get it to feel a little less scary once we practice these other things.
Thank you, Laura. And Dr. Keene, I wanted you to also, does anybody have a fear of flying client in addition to Laura? Anybody else have one right now? Yeah, or any have had over the years, or I know you guys are not all only a year long into the Maxar program because you're in the Clinical Training Institute. But I can say that, yes, Alexis, you will probably have a fear of flying client at some point. So Alexis, if you wanted to chime in, or if you were just...
Yes, especially like this new year with all what's going on in the news of planes and everything. But I also think during like high vacation time, so like summertime, I remember seeing like an influx of everything. So that's why I asked earlier if like Dr. Camp, you thought like Sully, like something. One of the things I say is like probability versus possibility. So like, is it possible? Yes, but what's the probability? And I wrote that statistic down that you said of like, we can think of possibilities all day long, but what's the probability of it? And so with that film or just other things like that of like, okay, yes, this worst case scenario happened, but look, like, first of all, it hasn't happened since. And second of all, like it was a very successful, you know, pilots are very educated and, you know, for this, trained for that. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think things like that can be helpful. And even just because a lot of movies and shows have plane crashes depicted in them, it's kind of, and it's not an uncommon theme. And so I could see how somebody who maybe has that phobia would avoid those types of films. And so I think that could be a good exposure just to be able to watch those things and get through them. But yeah, I think that's a good example of your pilot has gone through a lot of training and knows what to do, and they train a lot of emergency situations. And so, yeah, it's possible. It's unlikely, but it is possible, and they've had training. I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Susan, did you want to speak to? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's
Susan,
okay. I just had I have a 6-year-old client who has flight anxiety, but I didn't think to like share a video of like a flight simulation with her. So you brought that into my mind. I wonder like if like seeing a pilot like could also help with like that anxiety too, like that situational exposure. That'd be cool. And even going to the like museum and seeing a plane in person. So this was helpful. I came up with like 3 new ideas. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know like the pilots, sorry, my cat is joining now. The pilots will carry like the wings and give those to kids. And I think that helps too with the anxiety, because then they feel like they're part of it. They're like the co-pilot. So yeah, I think if there is an opportunity to meet a pilot, talk to a pilot, see a plane in person, even if it's not one that's flying, those can all be good. I also saw a question about the breath work for different types of clients. again, those can be adapted. I know like for kids or if attention is difficult, doing like a feather race or straw breathing, things like that can make it fun, but also taps into like that breath work as well. So if you ever need any ideas for that kind of activity, feel free to reach out and I can give more information on what those actually look like.